Hello Year 11, welcome to another literature revision session. My one today is focusing on making comparisons between poems, and we're going to be looking at the big ideas. How can you draw out of a poem what the big ideas are and make links to the big ideas within other poems as well. So to begin, we'll start with a question to work with. This was taken from the June 2017 paper, and this is literature paper 2. And the question reads, compare how poets present the effects of war in Bayonet Charge and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. So I've pointed out for you 2 parts of the question that are really key for when you address this question. Firstly, comparison. The question explicitly tells you to compare, so you must ensure that you are talking about the poems together and that you are drawing those links between them. Now, they don't need to be similarities all the time. It is just as valid to talk about how poems have differences as well. And then every question will have like a focus, something that it wants you to sort of zero in on in the poems. And in this one, it's the effects of war. So sort of the ramifications of war, what happens as a result of war. Okay. So Bayonet Charge, as we know, is the poem that has been named. So remember, in the exam, you will have a question. It will give you one poem that it wants you to work with, and it will tell you to find another one then of your own. So using this then as our sort of model to look at big ideas, let's just revisit Bayonet Charge briefly. So this is written by Ted Hughes. He's a 20th century English poet. Now, something to consider here. He's obviously writing about an experience from World War I, so don't be fooled into thinking that he was around at that time, because he wasn't. His father, however, did survive World War I, and Ted Hughes does have himself military experience. He was a mechanic in the RAF as well before he went off to university. So although he doesn't have the experience himself that he writes about, he is aware of the environment in which he's writing about. So the poem focuses on a single soldier's experience of a charge towards enemy lines and describes his actions as he tries to stay alive. The soldier's overriding emotion is fear, which has replaced the more patriotic ideals that he held before the violence began. So the important thing to consider then with this poem is the fact that in the context of the poem, lots of soldiers signed up to join the force in the war based on the fact that they loved their king and country. They wanted to do their bit, and the use of propaganda really made them believe that they were doing something really honourable. But truth be told, the realities of conflict and what they were going to endure was not really made known to them. And therefore, when they're actually in battle, as demonstrated in this poem, those feelings of love and pride for your king and country wither away, because instead they are suffering and they are terrified. So feelings and emotions then, as I've just mentioned, terror is a key one for this poem. This poem challenges patriotism and shows how terror becomes the most powerful emotion when in battle. The soldier is driven by fear more than any more noble motive. So really everything that he's doing in this poem, he's not doing it because in that moment he's thinking, oh, I've got to do this for my king, I've got to do this for my country, I want to do the honourable thing. He's purely fighting to stay alive. And then another one is confusion. In this poem, the soldier is physically and mentally disorientated. by what is happening around him, and he is questioning what he is doing there at all. So we'll have a quick read through of the poem, just to remind ourselves. Suddenly he awoke and was running, in raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. Hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air, he lugged a rifle, numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment then he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like a statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open, silent, his eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. So, thinking about this skill of comparison then, the key really is to make sure that you are addressing the bigger picture of the poems. This is where some students really struggle to access anything above a level 3 in the mark scheme, and to push through the boundary to get to that level 4 that shows a clear understanding. You have to demonstrate an understanding that you know that this is a whole text with a bigger purpose than just odd little techniques that you can pick out as you go through. So you have to consider looking at the poems like you are in an art gallery. So a bit like the picture is showing you here. Imagine the pictures on the walls are the poems. You have to take that step back so that you can see it all. And you need to ask yourself the two things that I've put up here. One, what are the thoughts, feelings and attitudes presented by the writer? So if it's about conflict, in what way do they write about it that shows how they feel? So for example, are they writing in a celebratory tone? Are they glorifying conflict in any way? Or is it a really somber tone where it shows that the writer clearly is saddened by the conflict or by conflict in general? Or is it bitter? Blake's London, for example, has a very bitter tone at times to show that real resentment towards what was happening at the time. And then obviously you need to ask yourself about the big ideas. What were the messages that the poets were trying to deliver? What did they want the reader to go away thinking? What did they want the reader to go away feeling about this topic that they're writing? Is it that they want us to learn something? Is it that they want us to question something? Is it that they want us to feel the same way that they do about the topic in general? Okay, is it that they're trying to expose something or criticize something? And are we supposed to come away from that with a changed idea for ourselves? Are we supposed to leave thinking, actually, yes, I feel how powerfully they communicated that criticism, that I too now have an understanding as to why that criticism was there? So all your ideas in an analysis essay should link back to this bigger picture, and all your analysis should be rooted in the bigger picture. So a trap that students tend to fall into is identifying features, which we call just feature spotting, where you say, right, I can see an adjective used here, I can see a metaphor used here, but you have to talk about it in the bigger context of the poem. So you need to ask yourself, what is the purpose of that metaphor in relation to the message that I know this poet was trying to deliver? Or how does that metaphor contribute to the tone that the poet is trying to create? Or how does that metaphor show me the poet's feelings? Okay. So I just wanted to show you very briefly 2 examples of where addressing the bigger ideas is done better and where it's not done well at all. So these are 2 sentences taken from the start of a paragraph, so what we would call the topic sentence. And topic sentences are really where you have to show the examiner that you are addressing those big ideas, because it's the place in your paragraph where you establish what that idea is, and you then go on to sort of prove that point to us with analysis. So where it's done well, it says both Bayonet Charge and Remains present the realistic effects of war on an individual. However, Bayonet Charge presents inner turmoil of a soldier during action, whereas Remains presents the conflicted mind of a soldier after conflict. Now, the bits in colour are where I can see that there is recognition of bigger ideas. And what's really lovely about this, and it's absolutely what you should be looking to do, is where the student has identified that there's a big idea that they have in common. They both present realistic effects of war. They both do that. But it's really nice when a student then can differentiate even further and say, whilst they are the same in one sense, Bayonet Charge focuses on the inner turmoil of a soldier during action, whereas Remains focuses on the conflicted mind after the action. And that shows a really good knowledge and understanding of the poem. So where it's not done so well, in both Bayonet Charge and Remain, they both speak about war and how it's one soldier fighting for his life and there is no looking back. It's a constant fight where they don't have time for anything, not even sleep. In Bayonet Charge, he says he awoke and was running. This shows how terrified the soldier is, and he has no turning back. He just has to keep on running. So the first thing I'd want you to notice there is that this is poorly written. There are errors all over the shop there. And I would probably be right in thinking that the student didn't plan, or if they did, they didn't plan well before they started writing their response. And the reason I know this is because there is no consideration of those big ideas. The analysis should come back to those big ideas, and the big ideas should obviously then point to you which points of analysis you are going to make, whereas the one that I've just read seems like a bit of a jumble. It gets straight into evidence, and it really actually just starts to repeat what the quotation is saying rather than analysing anything and considering the thoughts and feelings of the poet at all. So in Bayonet Charge, I've just spent a little bit of time here trying to pull out what I would consider to be 3 big ideas in that poem. So the first one is challenging patriotism and/or authority. Now the and/or there is mainly there just to sort of broaden the topic out slightly, so the idea out slightly, so that we can draw in other poems to compare. Now, the evidence that I would use to support that in the poem is the lines, "King, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm." So here, patriotism is being disregarded. And it's almost like Hughes here is mocking the idea of patriotism, because in the reality of conflict, it is the very last thing that a soldier is concerned about. So that list there, king, honour, human dignity, and then finishing it off with etc. Etc. is something we would use when we can't really be bothered to say the rest of it. So the lack of importance that is shown by that addition of etc. at the end just highlights those bitter feelings towards king, honour, those things that we associate with patriotism. And there's that simile, dropped like luxuries. But obviously, as a soldier, there were no luxuries. Going into battle meant all your luxuries that you've ever had no longer exist for you. So the fact that they can drop what once was the main and sole reason for some that they signed up in the first place, like the luxuries, shows how insignificant they are to them now. The priorities have shifted and changed enormously. The next one then, exposing the harsh reality of conflict. So my evidence here, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air, he lugged a rifle numb as an arm. Numb as a smashed arm. So in this poem, there is language to suggest just how brutal the conflict is for this soldier. So looking at the language here, you've got bullets smacking the belly out of the air. So that personification sort of highlights just how violent and aggressive the bullets are and the impact they have when they meet the air. And he lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. So this idea of it being a complete liability, and lugging, that verb lugged suggest, it suggests that it's sort of weighing him down. You know, the exhaustion that we assume comes along with that sort of shows how challenging it is to just hold on to the one thing that you have to keep you safe at this point. And then we've got internal conflict. So by this, what I mean is almost like the conflicts within a person at the time. So that can be conflict in emotions, maybe conflicting actions, conflicting feelings about things. And my evidence for this one here, in bewilderment then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nation was he the hand pointing that second? So that comes right at the start of stanza 2. And that hyphen at the end of the first line encourages the reader to pause. Hughes wants us to pause here very much in the same way that he describes the soldier as pausing. And it's almost like in the chaos of what's happening, his body has been responding to what is going on around him before his brain has had chance to catch up with what is happening, because he's just been so conditioned to responding immediately when conflict is happening around him. And then that metaphor, cold clockwork of the stars and nations was he the hand pointing that second. So he draws this comparison to his role in conflict being like a piece of clockwork. The idea that all these tiny pieces working together like mechanics. And he's saying, which part of that clockwork am I? He doesn't really seem to understand what he's doing here now or why. And the fact that it's described as cold clockwork, absent of all feeling, there is just very little consideration for the suffering that he endures as a result of this. And the use of the rhetorical question as well there does highlight the fact that for a moment he's pausing and he really is questioning himself now. He's having to think, what was the reason that I am here? So now you have to think, once you've drawn out those big ideas, you now need to make sure that at all times they are relevant to the question. And in your response, you need to be always drawing back to the question. And advice for this is just make sure you're always using the words of the question. So the effects of war should be punctuated throughout your response to ensure that the examiner knows you are responding to the question and that your ideas are relevant. So for each one here, what I've done is just put a little note to explain how that big idea does link to the question. So in terms of challenging patriotism and or authority, so the effect of war here, Hughes is mocking patriotism, as I've said. This soldier loses sight of the reason he went into conflict in the first place due to the horrors he is encountering. So the effect of conflict in this poem on that soldier is the fact that he just loses all sight of what he's doing there because of how horrific his situation is. Conflict has destroyed his feelings of patriotism because those they are fighting for have put them into a terrifying situation where their efforts to continue fighting feel futile. So that word futile, it means pointless. They don't understand the purpose. And it was understood at the time that soldiers did feel that their efforts were futile because they were dropping like flies and they really didn't see an end to what was happening. I mean, if you remember, they were told that the war would be finished by Christmas, yet the war stretched out and they endured this for 4 years. So internal conflict, the effect of war. I'm going to mention again that section we've just looked at. In stanza 2, the soldier battles between the desperate and urgent need to stay alive and the realization that he is just a tiny pawn in a much bigger game played by those who are not having to suffer the realities of conflicts. He is disposable at the hands of those in charge. So in this moment, he is completely torn between the fact that he has to fight, he has to run, he has to suffer, he has to keep himself alive in whatever way he can, whether it's for the king and country or just because he doesn't want to die, even though we understand in this poem that the desire to do it for patriotism is not there anymore, but the desire to stay alive is. But he's torn between this this desperation to stay alive and his realization that he is disposable. He is just one of the tens and hundreds of thousands that were sent out to do the work, sent out by those in charge, and those that are sort of controlling, moving the chess pieces around. They aren't the ones really that have to suffer in quite the same way. Right, exposing the harsh reality of conflict. So this effect of war, it's the severe and inexplicable suffering. So I say inexplicable suffering because there are a few moments in this poem where you can see that Hughes's use of language suggests that the suffering is so severe that there just isn't imagery or there just aren't words to really do the suffering justice. Just as a random example, in stanza 2, he says, he was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs. So that's a really obscure line because he's essentially repeating himself and saying he was running like a man who was running, which really is not a useful comparison at all. But what that language does tell us is that there's just no way of explaining the sheer panic and distress and confusion in that moment. There is no other way of putting that into words. Right, so at this point, what I'm doing here is just modelling for you how I would then think about linking with other poems. So the bit in the boxes in the middle with the coloured box around them, those are the big ideas that we've just discussed in Bayonet Charge. And what I've done here is tried to show you how you need to think in terms of these big ideas. And I've tried here to show you the sorts of links I would make around those big ideas. So for Bayonet Charge, the challenging of patriotism and or authority. So if we start with Checking Out My History by Agard, a couple of quotes that come straight to mind for me. Bandage up me eye with me own history, blind me to my own identity. So here, Agard is also challenging the way in which his true identity was hidden from him under a Eurocentric education system. So he too is sort of acting out against and questioning what has been imposed upon him. Another one there, I carving out me identity. I might have typed that just slightly wrong. I think from memory, I'm carving out me own identity. Sorry if that's not quite right. But here Agard challenges that education. He is challenging it, but he is actively seeking out his identity in spite of his education. So there is a much more hopeful and positive tone being used really there at the end of that poem, which I wouldn't say is there at all for Bayonet Charge. So that is another way that you can think about them having sort of the same or a similar big idea, but then addressing it and having sort of similar feelings about it, or different feelings I should say. Then we've got Exposure by Wilfred Owen. So at the end of one of the stanzas, he asks, what are we doing here? And so for me, reading that, I feel like there is a real emphasis on the futility of war. Again, that pointlessness. They are really questioning their purpose. Their role in the bigger picture of war has become lost and clouded by their suffering. They are at the mercy of the severe weather conditions in this poem, remember, and they just don't understand what they're suffering for anymore. There's a lot of questions being raised in Exposure about religion, feeling like God has turned back on them. So another point there, shutters and doors all closed. On us, the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. So that's at the end of another stanza. And this there then does challenge those in power. They feel abandoned and left to suffer the consequences of someone else's decision to go to war. So you've got that sort of repetition of an idea. Shutters and doors all closed. On us, the doors are closed. That repetition is emphasising that sense of abandonment, the fact that they are, it's almost like those who have sent them out have closed the door on them and say, well, you can go on and do the dirty work now. And then we turn back to our dying. That sense that all they are doing there is dying. They don't have a greater purpose, or they don't feel like they have a greater purpose. So there's that really sad sense that the soldiers, similar to Bayonet Charge here, don't really understand why they are there anymore. They are there merely out of an act of duty, but the suffering is clouding that now. Right, Kamikaze by Garland. So the opening of the poem has the following lines, or the opening stanza I should say. A shaven head full of powerful incantations and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. So if you remember, kamikaze pilots is part of the Japanese culture, and it was considered to be the greatest honour to give your life in a suicide mission of a kamikaze pilot. And the soldier's pride and love for his country here has convinced him that he should sacrifice himself. And that use of the noun incantations meaning sort of like spells, almost demonstrates how it's become like a mantra in his mind. It's convinced him, it's fully convinced him that this is what he should do, but also what's expected of him. And then these lines afterwards come from towards the end of the poem. To live as though he had never returned, she said he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So at this moment, it is really quite sad. And it calls into question the impact that forcing soldiers to act in the name of patriotism have. So this soldier felt compelled to give up his own life in the name of patriotism because it's embedded in his culture that it is honourable to do this. But the way in which this poem ends does call that into question, because the sad tone and the sense of abandonment for this father really sends a message here of, is this right? Should a soldier really have to suffer this sense of abandonment and basically not exist anymore in the eyes of those he loved, just because patriotism and his culture almost dictated that he was supposed to do something that he, with his own free will, decided he didn't want to go through with. So the next one is exposing the harsh reality of conflict. So straight away I thought of exposure again, because this one's really quite nice at drawing to attention the reality, the harsh reality. So the poem has in the first stanza, our brains ache in the merciless iced winds that knife us. That language of pain is really prevalent here, and it emphasises the suffering of the soldiers and the harshness of the conditions they were in. Now remember, this poem deals more with the abuse, shall we say, of nature than of the soldiers on the other side. But that is a reality that Owen is trying to draw the reader's attention to, because it's a way of suffering that maybe people at home didn't think would exist. You know, you think of war and you think that you're frightened and terrified and in pain because of the actual physical fighting with the opposing side. But actually what we see here is that nature on its own can do a hell of a lot of damage. And then we've got the last line of one of the stanzas, well, of quite a few of the stanzas actually, but nothing happens. And this structural device of repeating that phrase to end quite a few of the stanzas is significant in drawing to attention the reality of monotony. Again, something else that Owen draws attention to here is the fact that actually a lot of time is spent waiting, just waiting for the moment that you have to suddenly get yourself together and fight for your life. And that boredom is also a way in which that the soldiers are suffering. And that repetition, that structural device, repeating that phrase to end stanzas on a number of occasions, is reinforcing that message, but nothing happens, but nothing happens, but nothing happens. Then we've got Charge of the Light Brigade, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Not though the soldiers knew someone had blundered. And then in a separate place, theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. And then another one, stormed at with shot and shell. So these examples that I've chosen highlight the harsh reality that they must do as ordered, even if this means riding into your own death. So that quotation in the middle, theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. That last one there is really quite hard hitting. It's saying, you know, even if those soldiers knew that someone had made that blunder and that they were going to be riding into brutal attack, an onslaught from the enemy, it is not their place to do anything but just to do it and die if they have to. So this highlights the brutal attack on the soldiers and the fact that mistakes are made in conflict, but it doesn't tend to be the ones who made the errors that suffer. So again, this is another example of those pawns in the bigger game, where actually they're a small piece in a much bigger game, and they're just being sort of moved around and told where to go. And you know, if something happens to them, well, that's a shame. But it's the ones that are in charge making those decisions, but don't necessarily feel the suffering in quite the same way. Right, then we've got war photographer. Another one I considered about exposing the harsh reality of conflict, and this one's interesting because it gives the reality of conflict, but from an alternative perspective, not just looking at the soldiers as we've seen already. So in the line, something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. And on another line, 100 agonies in black and white. So this draws attention to the traumatizing effect conflict can have on those that merely witness conflict rather than having to fight. So the fact that after returning from the place where conflict was happening and the war photographer was working, the memories of that are being relived. And you know, she's talking quite literally about the fact that in the developing room, when you're watching an image develop, obviously the shapes are sort of distorting and twisting around and sort of forming themselves. So there is a literal meaning there, but more metaphorically, you could almost question whether that's also referring to the memories, those figures forming like this ghostly presence before his eyes, as he relives the horrible scenes that he has seen. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. So here, the reality is that in conflict, there are those who have a job to do. They have work, and the trauma this leaves behind is still severe and long-lasting. And the fact that it says there, his hands which did not tremble then, though seem to now. So it's quite similar, maybe you could argue, to a soldier suffering PTSD, where in the moment their body just deals with what's happening, but it's not until afterwards, when those memories start to come back, that actually your body suffers more the impact of what's happening. And so that would be maybe an idea why that his hands are trembling now, even though they weren't at the time. He had to hold himself together at the time, but now he's away from it. Those memories will start to come back and affect him severely, despite being away from the conflict. Spools of suffering in ordered rows and running children in a nightmare heat. So these two lines in particular use imagery that draws attention to the pain and misery caused by conflict. But it, again, a bit like I've already mentioned in the one before, it highlights the impact it has on those that are not just soldiers. So the running children in a nightmare heat. It's really, really distressing to think of children running away from conflict, and even their environment is painful to them, that nightmare heat. So yeah, we see the effect, the harsh reality of conflict, but from a perspective that isn't necessarily just the soldier at battle. Then we have Remains by Simon Armitage. So in this section here, sleep and he's probably armed, possibly not. Dream and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and drugs won't flush him out. So there's a real focus here on the soldier's reality post-conflict. So again, this offers a different perspective to just a soldier currently in conflict, because this one is talking about the harsh reality of conflict after the conflict has happened. So Armitage draws attention to the fact that the trauma of conflict lives on past the time when a soldier returns home. And in those lines in particular, there's a really interesting use of structure here, because those lines, he's probably armed, possibly not, and torn apart by a dozen rounds, they appear earlier on in the poem. And so the repetition of those lines later almost mimics how the memories repeat on him in the state of PTSD. So we've got sleep and dream being interrupted by these lines that suggest that the memories come back and interrupt him. Okay, and on another occasion, we get sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank. So here, that is literally the first line, on another occasion. So we're sort of getting into the poem feeling like we're already mid-conversation. So the tone here is very conversational. But this highlights the fact that violence and trauma is part of the everyday life for this soldier. The fact that it's on another occasion suggests that this is not something that happened in isolation. This suffering, this trauma has not happened on its own. This soldier has suffered many occasions like this, and this is just one that he's deciding to share. And then the last one, I think this is, internal conflict. So I've come back here to kamikaze, because this one works quite well with this big idea. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boat strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. So because of the power that patriotism embedded into his culture, the soldier feels compelled to sacrifice his life. But upon seeing nature, he remembers the beauty of life and decides not to end his life. So for this soldier, there is a real internal conflict, that pull from his culture and patriotism, that real desire to die and serve your country in a real honourable way. But also he clearly had a real desire to live his life. And so he is very conflicted. And the sad reality here is that he chooses to spare his life, but the rest of his, all the people in his life turn their back on him because they believed he made the wrong choice. Then checking out my history again, them tell me about Florence Nightingale and She Lamp and how Robin Hood used to camp. Them tell me about Old King Cole was a merry old soul, but them never tell me about Mary Seacole. So there is conflict here for John Agard between the history that was put upon him and his own history that forms his identity. So the focus here is on the unclear identity that he has as a result. And he's conflicted here because there is this sense of displacement, not really knowing where you fit. He's grown up his whole life with a very Eurocentric education, and therefore he's been deprived of a real understanding of his heritage and where he really came from. So there's that sense of conflict of not knowing what your true identity is. But as we've said before in this poem, it ends with that more hopeful sense that he's actively seeking that out now. And then finally I come back to remains. Whilst myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. So that comes from very early on in the poem. And then much later, in fact the very last line, he says, his bloody life in my bloody hands. So there's real conflicted feelings regarding responsibility here. having to live with what you have done, but knowing you only did what you thought was right in the conditions you're in. So at the start of the poem, when he says myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, there is a real focus on the soldier trying to make sure that we know as a reader that it wasn't just him. And you can see here by the language, somebody else and somebody else. It almost doesn't matter who it is, as long as we know that it wasn't just him. And the fact that all of the same mind, we all thought it. You know that feeling when you're in trouble, but you think, oh yeah, but it wasn't just me. It might lessen the blow a little bit. It's that same sort of idea. But by the end of the poem, there's that real heavy moment for him when he says, his bloody life in my bloody hands. And that use of the pronoun my shows a shift from that collective responsibility he was talking about at the start to actually realizing that he is responsible. He does carry that guilt. And that's conflicting for him, because he would not have wanted to do what he did, but the situation he was in, which was out of his control, almost made that happen. And finally, he's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines. So the soldier wants to be able to forget the trauma of conflict, but the nature of PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, means that he will suffer with these memories for the duration of his life. So that conflict between not wanting to live it again and wanting to escape it, but the illness that means he can't, that is going to be, he's going to be reliving this over and over again. And that language there, he's here in my head when I close my eyes. So he literally talks about the fact that even closing his eyes, that person is there again, dug in behind enemy lines. Well, obviously you've got that language of conflict being used there, but the verb dug in, or dug I should say, suggests that it is so deeply rooted into his mind, into his brain, that he can't escape it. As much as he thinks he might not be, those thoughts haven't come to him for a while, they are there and they will resurface again. Okay, so just some final thoughts to wrap up. So I've put here, begin with the big ideas. Going into your analysis, you have to start with the big ideas. That is where you gain those higher marks from level 4 upwards, because you're showing that understanding of the bigger picture, and you're showing an understanding of the poet at work, the fact that he has constructed something with a bigger purpose. And then number 2, see where poems share similar big ideas. So obviously what I've just done there is a really long and drawn out version of what you would need to do in the exam quite quickly. And this will come with practice, but it also comes with a real solid knowledge of the play, the poems. You will not be able to recall those big ideas in quite that level of detail unless you really know the poem. So you have to have that knowledge secure. Next then, you need to ask yourself, what attitudes and feelings does the poet have on these ideas? So we already know that in terms of patriotism, for example, Bayonet Charge is questioning it, it's challenging it, it's almost critiquing the idea of patriotism. Are they being explored through the poem in a positive or negative tone? What is the impact of this? And then number 4, consider how they differ. Consider how they deliver those big ideas to the reader differently. For example, does one use imagery to deliver the ideas, whereas the other delivers that idea through the use of structure? So do they have the same big idea, but do they use different methods to do it? That would be an interesting point to make. Or do both poems use metaphors to deliver a similar big idea, but do so to create different effects? So could a metaphor in one poem be used to make us feel pity about something? And could the metaphor in a different poem be used to make us feel angry about something. They won't necessarily have the exact same effect because they're two different poets doing two different things. Final thing, practice. As much as writing practice responses is maybe not your idea of fun revision, it is how you are going to get better. And the more practice you have at drawing out bigger ideas and starting with those and focusing on those, the better you will get. And I'm going to reinforce one more time, it is those big ideas linking everything back to what the writer was trying to do that will get you the better marks. Thanks for making it through to the end if you've lasted this long, and good luck.